Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how to bridge a gap between user experience and development, or design and development, or designers and developers. My name is Marko. This is my Twitter handle, so you can follow me there. You can also ask me any questions after this. So a little bit about me. I'm a front-end lead at Ava, a Berlin-based company where we kind of try to revolutionize safety of individuals and organizations. If you want to know a little bit more how we do it with front-end, ask me after the lecture. I'm also tech speaker at Mozilla. Doing my PhD. Hopefully I'm going to finish it someday. I do a little bit book reviewing on JavaScript related topics, and generally JavaScript is my thing. So what do you see here? So here we see a brand book by Foursquare. So if you ever did any publishing, this looks a little bit familiar. But if you also did web development in the beginnings, developers always had a problem of how to get style guides. So usually a designer delivers this brand book, developer takes a look at it. Okay, it's not interactive, of course. It was difficult to be interactive at that point in time, but this is what we had, right? Right now they're currently used only in publishing, but some development teams still use them as reference. I saw so many times people using PDFs to rely on design, to rely on copying colors, copying fonts, and many other things. I think we're way past that right now, so I can imagine something like this happening if you give this brand book to a developer today. Yeah. I mean, I know a couple of cases where this happened. So after this, of course, your boss sees that book, it's in front of your office, thrown away, and he says, well, you have to do this. Like, we have to finish this project. I mean, I really care about your personal feelings, but it doesn't make sense. And then the developer takes it and he says, okay, fine, I'm going to do it. Yeah, okay, I'm chilled. I'm going to build this thing, right? And this usually looks something like this, I think. Does it look familiar? I think so, yeah? And then we're ended up with something like this. So we end up with an app that has 10 different types of buttons for the same thing, different sliders, but they all do kind of similar stuff. So like different fonts, different colors, and everything in the same app. So if you ever faced with something like this, you know that you have a problem, and it's really hard to go back after something like this. So basically we had to make mistakes in order to be better. And then we figured out, okay, we need to have a system. So we started doing design systems. Like, as a definition says, well, one of the definitions, a single source of truth. Basically, a design system is a lot more than developers usually think of. When we say design system, developers think of style guides. But it's not just a style guide. So it consists of mainly tangible and non-tangible elements, where the tangible elements would be something like a style guide, pattern library, components, buttons, whatever, tools that we use. So, you can use Adobe XD, you can use Sketch. This is all parts of a design system. But also some non-tangible elements, like mission, like goal, vision, all of these things belong there. Since I'm a developer, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the tangible elements. So, of course, style guide, one part of the design system. So it focuses on colors, fonts, maybe some background images, layers, and how we use them, but also how we combine all of these things, like how we integrate these colors and fonts into structural components. But when we're thinking about building a design system from a technical standpoint as a developer, we need to think of like not what we can place there, because if we start thinking, okay, I have all these buttons, everything should be in my design system or in my style guide. I have like different colors for different buttons. Okay, I should place everything there. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, because you need to think about who is going to use this design system. So is it going to be developers, maybe designers, maybe clients, or everyone? So we need to find some bridge between these two things. And there's a good example of a design system built by a company called Salesforce. I think you've heard of it. So here we can see how they did, like, basically, it's always split into two, I would say, views, where on the left is something like a tree view, where you can list all of the components grouped in some sense. So like you see here design guidelines, you see utilities, tokens, buttons, blueprints, and we can see all of the colors that they're using, different ways they're using these colors. Of course, there's always components, so we can see that they have buttons, cards, carousel, checkboxes, and all different states of these things. By the way, Salesforce design system is used, I think, both by clients and developers. But although it's a very good system, and it's very detailed, and a lot of time has been invested into something like this, when we're talking about building apps in React, Angular, Vue, or any other framework, this tends to be a little bit problematic. But there are definitely pros in why you would want to do something like this. So because it's completely framework agnostic, they build this in pure HTML, CSS, and a little bit of JavaScript. Easy to run, just run the index usually if no external resources are needed there, and it's pretty straightforward to prototype these design systems. And when you're building something like this, you can always rely on Bootstrap, Material Design, or anything like that. But there are cons. So you have components that you build in Angular, and maybe there's some weird drop-down search tree view component. We have these components at my office for some reason. Of course, designers first had to build this component in some tool, like Sketch or whatever, and we say, okay, we're going to build this. And there are always some limitations there. So designers imagined that we're going to have some weird-looking scroll bar there, but you know the limitations of Chrome and Firefox and how you can style scroll bars. It's not that easy to do whatever everything the designers come up with. So we end up with something slightly different than the thing we had in the original design. So we're left with something designers developed and something we developed in Angular or React. And then we try to get something in between, and we develop a design system that looks something like I've shown before. And what that means is we would definitely have to build components more than once. So if you have a design system built in pure HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and you also have the same component that's built in Angular or Vue or React, that means you had to do these things twice. And it's very interesting that people still tend to do this where there's other options. It's always difficult to maintain these kinds of things because there's always a problem with inconsistency. You're left with implementation that's been the latest implementation that's been done in your code base in Angular, let's say, and you have your HTML, CSS style guide somewhere where that is completely out of sync with the current update. And of course, developers are going to say, well, designers did that design system. I built my component in Angular, so like, who has the responsibility of updating the design system? Why should I do it twice? I already built my component, right? So there's always ownership problems here. And this is how we came to the Storybook. So what Storybook is basically a development environment for UI components. It allows us to build components in Angular, Vue, React, and just to include them in the storybook in a form of stories, where each of the story has a special case where you describe a use case of that component. So basically, you can see different states of each component, and as many states as you can possibly imagine, which of course allows us to interactively develop and test and do many other things with these components. And of course, everything runs in isolation, so you can isolate each component and make sure that the component itself is pretty independent than the rest. So how many of you has heard about Storybook? Cool. How many of you has used Storybook? How many of you has been using Storybook actively? Okay, nice. Cool. So some of you already know the advantages of this, and I'm gonna try to convince you that there are many more of them. As you can see, one of the supported frameworks, like all the main ones, also Polymer, and it's used by Airbnb, Lonely Planet, Slack, Coursera, Uber open source. So there's also a lot of examples of these projects that you can take a look at and see how they implemented this. I like to show a nice example of React D&D, basically React drag and drop. It's basically a plugin for React where you can actually assign drag and drop functionalities to your components. So we can see here how it looks, how it works. But they had a lot of interesting functionalities that they want to implement here. And they said, well, it's always hard to test all of these cases, especially interactively. So they decided to try to implement the storybook for their project. So it's not like kind of a design system for a platform, for an app. It's a design system for basically a plugin, a module. So let's see how this works in real time. So we can see here storybook of React D&D, or React Beautiful D&D. And what we see here on the left is similar to what we've seen in the Salesforce design system, and basically it's always similar because people are used to something like always having these tree views with grouped context layers on the left, and on the right the content itself. So they have different stories here. So each item here represents one story, and each item within a story represents a case of the story. So basically here we see a single vertical list, and this is a basic view. So this is like the simplest story here that is listed. And we can see the drag and drop actually works pretty nice here. So keep in mind, this is a simple component integrated into a storybook. So we can test these functionalities very easy. So we can see how it looks within a larger scroll container. That when we scroll, it actually goes up. Important thing to test. Sometimes we forget. But then we have tables. Basically what they wanted to do is cover the functionality of their plugin through all different cases that they support. And the easiest way to do this interactively was Storybook. So we can see very simple examples, but the simplest examples are always the best. But there's also like some custom drop animations. I don't know if anyone would use this. If you decide to do this, let's talk. No animation. But as you can see, many different cases, and most of them are covered. So accessibility, very important thing that I love to talk about. Let's see how their component behaves when it's dragged, but with a blur. what you can notice is that this background color changing also adds a little bit to the effect, so it's a little bit more visible. You have to keep these things in mind, always. Some other examples come from Lucid UI. I don't know if anyone of you has ever used Lucid UI, but their tool is used for charts. And they have many different types of charts. So they also use Storybook. But you see, it looks a little bit different than on the previous example. This is because Lucid Chart is using version 4 of Storybook, and React D&D is using version 5. Version 5 has been released recently. But what Lucid does is it also shows you the code on the right, and it allows you to change or to see the value of the properties. So everything here is being done by add-ons for Storybook. So you can actually see your source code, you can see properties, you can actually change properties in Storybook. But here we see all the different things that are possible to be done here in the Lucid UI with Storybook. Coursera, I think, has the most detailed Storybook, and I think it's the only one that its source code is not available on GitHub. But you can see they really covered their basics, so you can actually see all the colors, all of the different boxes that they use, footer. They actually, I think, imported everything that they use in Coursera in Storybook, because there's so many different things. But as you can see, like a lot of practical examples, how it's used, and in different cases. So we saw how Module is using it. We saw how a company is using it on like a global level, and charting library also. So what we wanted to show here is how to use Storybook with Angular. Why with Angular? Well, mainly because Storybook was developed primarily to be used with React, but as it gained popularity, other frameworks joined in, and I want to show you that it's pretty straightforward to use it with any framework, so Angular was my way to go here. Simple steps if you want to try this out at home or something, install Angular and then install Storybook. Basically, the only dependency here is Babel, so you have to keep in mind to use that. What I'm going to show you here today is a test application that is basically a project management tracking app built in Angular version 7. So something similar to Trello. You know Trello, right? Yeah, so something similar to that, like very simple because I built it in a couple of hours. But it uses drag and drop module from Angular material. So I wanted to make kind of a short connection with React D&D to demonstrate what we can do similar to what they did, like in a couple of minutes. So everything I'm going to show here is hosted on my GitHub, and there's also a live example on my GitHub IO. So if you go here, I think you have QR scanner on your phones. You're free to scan this, and you'll get the link of the app. I'll leave it a little bit for you to test this. It should be responsive enough, I hope. If you're worried that you don't have a QR scanner, if you have Chrome, you have a QR scanner. So if that's that, you're gonna end up with something like this. So similar to Trello, right? I can sell this. And it has the three columns: to do, in progress, done, and basically you have functionality of taking these tasks and moving them around. however you want. As you can see, unpack your stuff is still in to do because I don't have any stuff. It's somewhere in Moscow, I hope. Aha, it's a good question. We'll go back to that. Well, basically, we can visualize here, I think, already 3 components. Our root component or our app component. We can see our task list component, and we can see our task component, or like that represents a single task. So of course, it's very simplified for the examples that I'm going to show. But as you can see, all of the tasks here have some color labels, have the name of the task, have a date, have an assignee, which is basically a picture. And what you can do with them is you can actually just move them around and place them in other columns. So you can also test this on your phone. And how this looks in our code. So this is our task component. Very basic, very simple. If you ever did anything in Angular, you know straight away what it is. So we're just using, basically referencing the HTML template and just passing on an object that is an item. And in the HTML, we're using this information. So we can see here an array of labels where we're basically using the value of the label to set the background color, the name for the name, and we use our dates, and we use an image or like a name of the assignee to load an image. So when we go back to our code, we can also see our task list, where our task list is contained of iterating through the items list and including our app task, where we pass on each item of the item list to our task item. So that way everything here is connected to one another. So when we go back and run Storybook, I'm first going to show you how to do that. After you installed it, you have to do a little bit of a setup. So basically, you in the root of your project, you add .storybook and you add a simple config. Config file should, for starters, for some simpler examples, should just load all of your stories. I like to separate stories per component. So if you have different components, you should have different stories, and in those stories you can test different cases of the components. And in the source directory or wherever you want to place it, you place these stories. So we can see that we have our task list component story, where we first load some of the dependencies. As you can see, the dependency that I have here is drag and drop module. That's the module load from Angular material that allows me to drag tasks. And I use a task component. So these are the dependencies. The title that you enter here in the stories of is the title that will be displayed as a story title on the left in the tree view part of the storybook. Every single case that you add, string that you add here, will be displayed as a case name for that story. So here we see that we want to use our task list component, and as properties we add an item list and a name. So I said I first want to see how this looks without any tasks. So let's see that. So this is how it looks without any tasks. It looks weird a little bit, right? If I click here, okay, yeah, this works. There's no image, but yeah, it works. But still, it looks a little bit weird without any task. It looks like you cannot do anything there. And this is why Storybook is pretty good. It enabled me to visualize how my single component reacts in different situations. So it might make some sense to go into the task list CSS and do... I never done coding with a microphone. Whatever. And yeah, I mean, it might make sense. I'm not sure. if you add new one, you'll see there's some empty space or something like that. I mean, you can always figure out new different cases. And at my company, we tend to give our QA engineers also to play around a lot with Storybook, because they always figure out some weird case that we haven't entered here, and we always add new things into our Storybook. But to go back here, so we can also test how it looks when we added any added tasks. So in the items list array, we add different tasks with different names, different labels, dates, whatever. So of course you can pass on any types of objects here. It's just up to you how you want to use this. So if you go here with added tasks, we can see, and what is good about this is it helps a lot to bridge this gap, because after the initial development is over, like we created a component, we basically poured all of the components, or like not pour, include them into Storybook. What allows our design team then is to go over Storybook, look at each individual component by itself in its isolated context, and then do some minor tweaks. But keep in mind that doing tweaks in Storybook would also reflect the behavior of your app. So if they try to do something in the CSS that's related to this component, it will be changed in the app. Of course, everything goes through code review, everything goes through pull requests and stuff like that, so no one can do whatever they want. But it's very interesting that we have like a single source of truth, and we don't have two different things that describe one single component. And it helps us a lot to speed up. And when I'm talking about speeding up, like there's no more I did this, you did that, well, let's meet in the middle. So a single source of truth. When we go to our task component Storybook, we can see here the name is, I usually tend to give names of the components, but if it's a little bit more complex, it's important that it's descriptive enough so everyone can know what is happening. So we're testing different cases. We're testing cases with labels, with dates, with full data. You can add without dates. I mean, testing these things always figure out new ways that you haven't covered, which helps us a lot discovering bugs before they actually happen. So each individual component can be tested in many different ways. But when you click on the component itself, nothing happens. Of course, there's no like root index where to go. As you can see here, I'm also using version 4. I don't like to change versions a couple days before the talk. Never know what can happen. Maybe you can lose the luggage. And that's the thing. So running Storybook, pretty straightforward. You go into package.json and you just add a script that starts Storybook on a port that you can define. Basically here you list the port and you list the root directory of your configuration file. What we tend to do also, maybe some other teams are not keen on, we usually release the Storybook builds. So we kind of include the build of our Angular app with our Storybook, so we can publish it pretty easy. So if you go, if you scan the app, it's just enough to go Storybook here, and it will load the Storybook on your phone. Keep in mind, Storybook is not that responsive, so it will be very tricky to handle on the phone, but still it works. And it's very easy to publish this. So basically, you get to publish your app and you get to publish your Storybook all at once with basically one run of the script. So that's interesting. So we saw that it has a really nice integration with Angular, but it also does with React and Vue and other frameworks. It allows us this immediate feedback on everything that we do, and allows us basically versioning on design. And that is pretty tricky thing to do. At least we had many different problems with this. Who changed what, when, why, and versioning design and basically versioning user experience through Storybook allows us to have a single source of truth and pure consistency throughout the app. It helps with manual tests. As you can see, it has a potential to allow us the snapshot testing. Some of the companies are playing around with this. I still haven't seen anything like really usable, but I expect it really, really soon to have some like commercial project demonstrating this. But manual tests are the thing that we are most proud of there, because it allowed us to avoid common pitfalls there. Basically, as soon as a new issue arises on a component, we try to cover it up with Storybook. So kind of basically having test cases in Storybook helps a lot. As you saw, like there's different ways of how you can include this, but component isolation is one of the most important things there. So there are problems, right? It's not a silver bullet. It takes a little bit of time to implement this, to figure out how to include different things in your project. Like if your component is relying on some global state, like Redux or NGRX or something like that, there's some ways of how you can include these resources, but it's a little bit tricky. If your component basically sends an HTTP request to some service or something like that through a service, you have to include that service, but it's difficult to include that service if the service has a dependency on another service or something. If you do this, we need to talk. But generally, you can mock all of these things. Like you can mock it with interceptors, or you can just mock the service itself. So there are ways of making your component work as it works in your app. But it takes a little bit of time for you to get there. So not enough resources online, especially if you're using frameworks that are not React. But more and more people are getting involved in the project, and a lot of the contributors now are, I think, working full-time on Storybook, so it's getting a lot of traction. Official documentation is incomplete, but of course it's open source, so everyone can join in. I would recommend that. And yeah, the main problem, I think. Designers need to get familiar with the framework and the project setup. So how we tried this, we first had Angular workshops, and then we had Storybook workshops. But it works. Like, it really works. So keep in mind, yeah, you have to design modular to build modular. Storybook won't help you if you didn't separate your components properly. So if you have one huge component and you say, okay, I'm gonna do this in Storybook, then you have your app in Storybook, which doesn't make absolutely any sense. So always keep in mind to have components that are meaningful and that they can work in isolation, that are not dependent on different components, that are not dependent on too many services or external resources, that will always help you a lot later. So thank you.
We have 4 minutes and 22, 1, 20, 20, 4:20. Yeah. So we have time for questions. I have a question. How easy would it be to integrate with like a ClojureScript application?
Yeah, it wouldn't be too problematic. As I said, like maybe it would take 2 or 3 days to figure out how to include some of the dependencies, but it would work. It would work.
Cool.
Yeah.
thank you for your presentation. A question about how do you integrate styling and CSS, and do you have like CSS in JavaScript, or do you your designers are forced to do that, or how do you handle that?
No,
Thanks.
yeah, I can show you that in code. So basically, at least this is how I do things in Angular. It might not be a good thing, but you have every component has its own CSS. And when I include the component in Storybook, it uses the same CSS the component is using. So basically, there's no difference in how I would style the component and how it's styled in Storybook. The same CSS is used. So if I change something, let's say here in the task, let's say task list component, as you saw, like I added this height and it got changed in the Storybook, but it also got changed here. So yeah, I mean, I have a lot of different elements here, but maybe if I go and do let's go and do background color red. You see, it's the CSS that is used by task list component. So it's changed one-on-one. So one CSS. I don't use CSS in JS in a like common way, but
okay. I have a question. How about guidelines for designers, like source files, Photoshop files, some marks?
yeah, generally, like, of course, Storybook is not the first input, right? You first have to have something in a sketch or whatever, and then we build these things. But after we build them, we usually have a README file that's loaded in the initial Storybook root, where we describe all the cases, how you can use it. There's a trick of how to do that. Like, it's not described in the official documentation, but you might see it in Coursera's also. They also did this similar way. So there are ways of how you can basically add wiki to your Storybook, which helps a lot. Yeah.
Nice. That's it.
Thank you very much.